next presenter, and I believe we have Renée here on the line. Welcome, Renée.
How are you,
Yeah,
Hunter?
I am really good. How are you today?
I am well. Thanks for asking. I'm really excited about being here and the opportunity to spend more time with your membership. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know that I'm excited. I know our members are excited. Um, so, very briefly, Renée Charles is an expert and facilitator in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've worked with Renée in the past, so this is not new for us. I myself have had the opportunity of interviewing Renée a couple times for our magazine, as well as we hosted 3 webinars, a series of webinars on diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2021. Our members can access those webinars on our webinar archive. I do recommend that you go and you view those sessions in our webinar archive. They're very informative, certainly still very relevant and timely. And today we're going to kind of take that topic and apply it to the process of uh, of of tenant selection. We're going to start with a bit of information from Renée and then move on to some Q&A. So welcome, Renée, and I
Excellent.
will mute and go off video over here and just let me know when you are done, and I will come back into your Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks, Hunter. And I brought some slides to help facilitate our conversation today. So I will just get those loaded in preparation for our conversation. So thank you for the warm welcome. And I want to say thank you to everyone who's online today. No doubt our days are always busy. There's always lots on our plates. So the fact that you press pause on all that's happening around you to be part of the conversation today is most certainly appreciated. So as Hunter said, what I wanted to do is kind of build on the foundation that was laid, I can't believe, right, 2 years ago, when we took a look at some of the nuts and bolts of this thing called DE&I. Today, I wanted to look through the lens of inclusion specifically and really highlight the fact that inclusion, quite literally, starts with the letter I, but inclusion also starts with I, right? Meaning me, right? The individual and the choices that I make around how I interact with people who, want rental housing, and even people who I work alongside with. So I think it's always important to, build on, well, why are we here and why is this conversation so important? And to help answer that question, I share this image with you. And there's a story behind this image, and it's a story about a traveler. And the traveler has been traveling for quite some time. So they're tired, they're hungry, and they need a place to stay. And in addition to a place to stay, they also would really appreciate some food to eat. So they stumble upon a village, and they're really hopeful that as they go into the village, that someone will be kind enough to offer some food to eat and maybe some shelter. So the traveler knocks on the first door, and someone opens the door, and the traveler says, I've been traveling for so very long. I'm wondering if you might have a little food to spare and, a little shelter that you might offer. And the person who answers the door says, I'm sorry, right? I can barely feed my own family. Our house is full. So a little disappointed, right? The traveler says, I'm going to try again, right? Moves on to the next door, knocks on it, asks the same question, and it's kind of the same response, door after door after door. So the traveler eventually finds themselves in the square, right? It's kind of the center of the village, and decides that they are going to make themselves some soup. So they build a small fire, they pull a small pot out of their bag, they pour some water into the pot, and they drop a small gray stone into the pot once the water starts boiling. So passersby, right, are quite curious about what's happening and who is this person? What are they doing? So the first person stops and says, hello. And the traveler says, hello to you. And the person, the villager, says, what are you doing? And the traveler says, I'm making stone soup. And the villager says, I've never had stone soup before. I'm wondering, would carrots be good in stone soup? And the traveler says, absolutely. So the villager disappears, right? They return with some carrots. And in the meantime, other people's curiosity has been piqued as well. Someone comes by and says, would onions be good in stone soup? Absolutely, the traveler says. Another person says, hey, I've got some salt and pepper that I can spare. Might those be good for stone soup? So before long, right, a number of villagers have come by, a number of villagers have made, a contribution to the soup. And before long, just a little bit more time, the traveler removes the stone from the pot and declares that the stone soup is now ready. And interestingly enough, based on the contributions that everyone has made, there was enough to be shared by all. So some of you may be familiar with the story of stone soup. It might bring back memories of childhood, and whoever raised you may have shared that story with you. What does that have to do with what we're talking about today? What is the connection to this thing called inclusion? Well, most certainly it's important to recognize that, we're all valuable and we all have valuable contributions to make. We have this deep desire as human beings to be seen, to be heard, and to know that we matter. And most certainly when it comes to providing housing, right, and shelter, similar to the traveler, it's something that we all need to survive and thrive. Now, to build on this, I wanted to bring in some thinking, actually, to continue to build on, this notion of, well, why are we here? Why is this conversation important? And I wanted to bring in some thinking from Brene Brown. For anyone who's familiar with her work, that she talks a lot about courage and bravery. She talks about empathy, right, and sympathy, which we're going to get into as we go forward in our conversation today. But what I love is this perspective around connection. Because certainly if we think back to the story of stone soup, the traveler really wanted connection, right? He wanted someone to connect with him, right? And be kind enough to offer a little bit of food, right? A little bit of shelter. What Brene Brown says is that connection is all about energy, right? And it's the energy that's connected when we can send a message to others that say, I see you, I hear you, and I value you. And I see you and hear you and value you enough to want to give you fair access to housing, because I know that you need that to survive and thrive. Now, to continue on, right, this pathway of connection, right, and bring it a little bit closer to, business, right? Richard Branson, which I would argue knows a thing or two about running successful businesses, says, what, at the core, right, success in business is rooted in connection. So I'm here today to kind of sprinkle a few seeds into the conversation, not just about connection and the value of it, but also what are some of the things that can get in the way of not only forming connection, but what can get in the way of us making good decisions as we review applications for people who need and want housing. What are some of the traps that we might step into because of our perception, because of our thinking? So at a high level, that's what I'm here to share with you today. And it is really all about the way we see the world, right? And what we think and the stories we tell, right? What we feel, right? And how can those stories, those internal narratives and dialogues, those thoughts, those opinions, those beliefs, those attitudes that we have about people who might be different from us, right? How do all of those things either help us to make connection or create obstacles to connection? How do those things help us to make good decisions, right? And how do those things maybe get us into trouble? Right? So with that, what I want to do is run us through, right, a series of bias traps that we may step into, not on purpose always, right? Sometimes accidentally. And with this idea of intention, or being intentional or being accidental, it actually brings us to two kind of at a high level, two very big buckets of bias. And as I weave this language into the conversation, you might be familiar with some of it. And if you are, fantastic, right? The goal is to just deepen our understanding and raise our awareness. But I'm also hoping that some of the language I'll weave into the conversation might also be new to you. So starting with this thing called conscious bias. These are the thoughts, the beliefs, the attitudes, these perspectives, the opinions, the narratives, the dialogues, the stories that we have in our heads that we know are there, right? We're very aware, right, that I have this view about people who are different from me, right? We call that conscious bias. But we also have this thing called unconscious bias. And this is where I have an attitude, a belief, a thought, a perspective, an opinion, a narrative that I don't know is there. And the reason why I don't know it's there is because it's so deeply rooted. It's probably been around for a very long time that I don't recognize that it exists, which also makes it very difficult to recognize when it might be leaking out, right, into my decision making, when it might be popping up into conversation that I might be having with people. So what I want to do is kind of put our knowledge of conscious and unconscious bias to the test. And I have a few experiments. And I know the Q&A is open, and we've been, keeping it open for questions. And you're more than welcome to share questions, as we go through. And Hunter and I will go through those questions at the end. But I'm also hoping, and maybe Hunter, I'll check in with you. I'm also hoping that we can maybe use Q&A for the 2 experiments that I have around conscious and unconscious bias. And would it be okay for me to lean on you, Hunter, to let me know what people are maybe saying in the Q&A?
Most certainly.
Okay, amazing, amazing. So let's start with conscious bias. So I want you to, for a moment, imagine that you are thirsty, right? You are parched. And, some of you might naturally reach for water, right, to quench that thirst. But sadly, all we have is cola, right? It's the only thing that's available. Now, because you're so thirsty, right, you're going to reach for the cola. What I want to know is if we presented 2 cola choices, right, which one would you choose? So, right, age old kind of test, right? So pop a 1 into the Q&A if you were like, yep, Coca-Cola would be my cola of choice. Give me a 2 in the Q&A if you're thinking, actually, no, I'd probably reach for Pepsi. Now, remember, right, this is all that's left. I know that you're like, oh, I don't touch the stuff, right? Some of you may be thinking about that, but, play along with me with this little experiment. So Hunter, I'll lean on you to let me know, what are we seeing in the Q&A?
We are seeing a fairly strong vote for a Coca-Cola over Pepsi.
Interesting. So, if I were to dig deeper and ask people why, right? And when I've done this experiment before, answers that I get back are, well, Pepsi is too sweet for me. I prefer, the taste of Coca-Cola. Other people might say, I find Coca-Cola a little bit harsh, therefore I lean towards Pepsi, right? And the list could go on and on. Other people say, I grew up on Coca-Cola, right? That's, what we had in my home. If ever we purchased, or if my parents or people who raised me purchased, cola, it would definitely be Coca-Cola. So we have all of our reasons for why we lean towards one over the other. But the point of this experiment is that we did choose one, and we do know why we chose it. That is my conscious bias, right? I lean towards one, which means I lean away from another, right? And I probably have rationale and reason that I'm very aware of, right? That is driving my decision in that moment, right? Conscious bias. What I want to do now is look at the other kind of big bucket of bias. And I have an experiment that's going to help us to take a look at unconscious bias. So same thing, there's an invitation for you to share your thinking in chat. And I'm going to invite you to kind of not think too long and hard about this. And there's a reason why I'm kind of throwing that out as a parameter, right, which I'll talk about later. But what you'll see in a moment is a riddle, right, or, a problem to be solved. And what I want to do is have you share in Q&A your answer, right, to this problem, riddle, question, first thing that pops into your head, right? So here we go. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. And if this is the case, how much does the ball cost? Right, so Q&A is open. Hunter, I'll lean on you. What are people saying once we see answers flowing through? People might be thinking it's Friday, Renee. My brain has just shut down. I can't do these mathematical questions at the moment. So what are we seeing, Hunter?
And we're seeing 10 cents.
Okay, as expected, interestingly enough. And, you are in good company because a large majority of the population, when they look at this riddle, their answer is also 10 cents. Now, if you were thinking 10 cents or you shared 10 cents in the Q&A, I regret to inform you that you are wrong. Okay. And if I share with you the solution, okay, the right answer is actually 5 cents. Okay. So if 10 was your answer, right, 10 cents is the cost of the ball. The bat cost $1 more than the ball, which means the bat cost $1.10, right? $1.10 and $1.10 and 10 cents is $1.20, right? But we know that we're dealing with $1.10. Okay? So this was an exercise in unconscious bias, right? I look at what's being presented in front of me, and I very quickly, right, make a conclusion, right? I have an answer, right? Often I believe that my answer is right. Like, I mean, how could it possibly be wrong? Hmm? But this highlights how quickly we can move to conclusion, right? And how often that conclusion can actually be incorrect. And just like with the bat and the ball, we often quickly move to conclusions about the people that we are interacting with, especially when those people are different from us in any way. And oftentimes, right, the conclusion we draw, right, is also incorrect. So with that being said, I want to use this knowledge of conscious and unconscious bias to dive a little bit deeper into some of the bias traps that maybe we step into. And, this is really important. I love this image because it's rooted in how do I see the world as I move through it, right? How do I see others as I interact with them, as I meet them, right? As their applications, cross my desk, and I have to make a decision around who gets the housing and who doesn't. So with that in mind, I want to kind of start here and highlight that what we think is absolutely critical. And what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling are actually closely related, right? And that green circle really speaks to what's going on for me internally. And what we know is that what's going on for me internally absolutely impacts and influences what happens externally, and that's the blue box. And if you remember nothing else from this part of the conversation, right, an easy way to remember the connection between the green and the blue is this idea that beliefs become behaviors, right? Beliefs become behaviors. So what I think, right, is going to shape and maybe reshape what I do or don't do, right? Decisions that I make, right? What I think, my belief that I embrace, whether it's conscious, whether I'm conscious of it being there, or whether it's an unconscious bias, right? That belief will affect my behavior in terms of what I say or don't say. And if we continue to look at this chain reaction, right? What I do or don't do, what I say or don't say, the decisions that I make, right, will absolutely impact or influence the results that I get. And that will either feed the cycle positively or it will feed the cycle negatively. So if we take a look at why this is relevant and what is the connection between this chain reaction and bias, right? Well, beliefs become behaviors, right? What I think might be rooted in bias. And if I'm making a decision based on some of my biases or stepping in a bias trap, I might find myself in a little bit of hot water. So with that in mind, I want to kind of walk us through a series of biases, starting with something called the negativity bias. And negativity bias, some of you may be familiar with. Negativity bias serves a purpose, which I will talk about in a moment, right? But negativity bias, when it's hyperactive, right? So when it's activated, too frequently, too often, if we just run with our negativity bias, most certainly it can lead us to making some not so great decisions, right? So negativity bias says that you have an opportunity to tell a positive story or a negative story about your current situation or circumstances, go down the negative path. Now, this tendency to be negative becomes hyperactive if we feel threatened, if we feel stressed out, You know, if, you know, we feel that our personal kind of safety in any way is being jeopardized, negativity bias will kick in. So what do I mean by that? You know, imagine yourself walking down the street. When you get to an intersection, the negativity bias kicks in whether you realize it or not. And it's your negativity bias that tells you, your brain, right, a story that says you might get hit by a car. So because of that negative story, what do? We look both ways before we step into the road. Okay? So negativity bias does serve a purpose, right? It's there to keep us safe. It helps to ensure our survival. But again, when it's hyperactive or when it's activated in the wrong moments, yes, the intention is to keep us safe. But what happens is we might not approach, we might avoid, we might overlook, we might bypass someone's application because we're not feeling safe about this person because they're so different from who we are. Right? So in that instance, the negativity bias, right, might be leading us in a direction that is, you know, not equitable, right, not fair. So another bias trap that we sometimes step into is something called affinity bias. Okay? And again, sometimes we're very aware of affinity bias. Sometimes it creeps up on us, right? And it's just this, you know, this little undercurrent, right, running just below the surface of our interpersonal interactions. So affinity bias says, you look like me, you dress like me, you sound like me, you talk like me, you were born in the same country as me, you grew up in the same community as me, you went to the same school as me, you know, maybe you play hockey like me. Therefore, I like you. I don't know very much about you. I just know that we have all of these things in common. And that feels like great connection, right? I have this affinity towards you. Now, what that means is if you don't look like me, don't dress like me, don't sound like me, weren't born in the same country as me, don't speak the same language as me, don't play hockey like me, didn't grow up in the same community as me, you know, I don't like you. Right. And, you know, it's not that I really know anything about you. I just know that there's all this difference that exists between us. And these differences, again, make me feel unsafe, right? Or unsure. And instead of approaching you, I avoid you. Instead of including you, I exclude you. Instead of approving your application for rental housing, I might overlook your application or deny your application for rental housing. So affinity bias, right, is about connection. And it's just that I feel a stronger connection to people who feel the same or similar to me. Let's keep going and take a look at something called the halo effect. So again, sometimes we're aware of it, conscious bias, sometimes we don't know, right? That it's crept into our interaction and our decision making. So the halo effect says, you know what, generally speaking, right, this person is a good person, right? I've seen them do kind things. You know, they're just nice, right? Therefore, I think they're nice and kind all of the time, which means that if they do something that is unkind, right, or that's not nice, I'll overlook it, right? I'll turn a blind eye. I'll pretend that it didn't happen, right? I'll ignore the misstep. So what that means is we see a halo, right? This invisible halo just hovering over this person's head, right? And even though they behave badly at one point or another, right, we say it's fine, right? It's okay. Well, we're going to let this one go because generally speaking, they're nice. Right? The halo effect. Perception bias. And I probably should have led with perception bias now that I'm thinking about it, because it's probably one of the biases that presents probably, you know, very early on, or it's one of the biases that presents maybe more often than others. And perception bias means, you know, I'm going to make a judgment or an assessment about who you are, right, without really knowing very much about you. Right, that judgment and assessment, sadly, is often inaccurate because I've made an oversimplification of the story that I'm telling myself about you. So perception bias is all about forming a very quick conclusion, often based on very limited information, or it's forming a very quick conclusion about you based on maybe prior experience or other stories that other people have told about their experience of you, or people who look like you, right? People who, identify with your diversity dimensions. So perception bias can lead to things like stereotyping, right? Where we put people in boxes, right? Instead of treating them as individuals, right? We end up viewing this person as a member of the group they belong to based on their diversity dimensions, versus giving this person a fair opportunity to show us who they are, right? As an individual, not a member of the community, right? That we think they're a part of. Okay, that's perception bias. Okay. Then we have confirmation bias, and oftentimes confirmation bias and perception bias actually go hand in hand. And confirmation bias is, I have the story, right? It's in my head, and I'm now looking for information that validates my current thinking, right? So confirmation bias is all about looking for that validation so that I can say, see, I told you so, right? I knew it, I just knew it, right? So what happens with confirmation bias is we actually move through the world with blinders on, right? And we're only looking for the information that sends a message back to our brains that says, I knew I was right. Versus removing the blinders, looking through a wider angle lens, right, at people and at the world, right, and being open to information that will actually invalidate what we think, that will undo the story, right, that we have swirling in our head that we're holding on to as truth. So confirmation bias says we're very narrow in our thinking, not open to any other possibility as it relates to this person, right, or this diversity dimension. It's confirmation bias. Okay. Expedience bias. I love this one because it's often, it's one that we don't often talk about. Right? But I think expedience bias runs through every minute, every hour, every day of our lives, both in and outside of work. And expedience bias speaks to the busyness that we experience when we're running a business, right? Or it's the busyness that we experience as we're just moving through life. Okay? So we are put in a position where we, will make a quick decision, a knee-jerk decision, instead of taking a step back and activating some curiosity, asking some questions, gaining perspective. Okay? So expedience bias is, what? I have a unit to fill, right? Let me quickly fill it, right? Versus leaving it vacant because I need to find out more information and do a little bit more digging in terms of credit checks or reference checks. So I act quickly versus taking my time. And that can skew my thinking or my decision making. So those are bias traps. And if we link it back to, this chain reaction that exists that, tell us that beliefs become behaviors and behaviors impact the results that we get. I very quickly highlighted an example, right? I have beliefs, feelings, attitudes, and opinions about people who are different from me. Right? That's fact, by the way. And I should probably weave into the conversation that we are all biased. Every single one of us in this meeting, myself included, right? We are all biased. And the reason why I say that and say it with such confidence is because we have this thing called life experience. Okay? We have these experiences that we've accumulated, right, along our own journey through life that can shape and reshape our thinking. Okay? So even though we are inclined to be biased, right, and by the way, bias, again, serves purpose sometimes. So even though we're inclined to be biased, right, if we don't pair our bias with choice, right, we may not make good decisions, right? If we don't pair our bias with curiosity, we won't stop and say, well, where does that thinking come from, right? Why am I feeling this way or reacting this way in response to this person? What's underneath that? Right? So pairing bias with curiosity can help us make better decisions, but sometimes for all of the reasons we just looked at, we don't make good decisions because we're stepping into bias traps. Okay? So this is this statement that you see here on the screen, true for everybody, right? Myself included. Okay? Now, if I act negatively, or if I'm taking this, bias, this perception, this story, this narrative, and, I use that to end up stepping in a bias trap, then what happens is we don't get good results, right? We got, things like stereotyping. You know, we get things like discrimination, right? And discrimination for me in very simple terms is I create hardship for someone, right? I make it very difficult for them to access, you know, resources and opportunities that they need to survive and thrive, right? So discrimination is about creating hardship for people. Mm-hmm. For stepping into bias traps, right, we might run the risk, right, of also finding ourselves dealing with any of the isms. Right? And what I mean by that is racism, sexism, ableism, ageism. Mm-hmm. So we're being discriminatory based on those diversity dimensions. And of course, all of those things potentially, right, could lead us to violating someone's human rights. Right? And of course, we've got the Human Rights Act, and you know, all of the protected grounds, right, that we need to be mindful of. So how do we avoid bias traps? I don't want to leave you stuck, right? I certainly want to give you some ideas, some insights, some things that you can do that, you know, hopefully will help you to shape or reshape your thinking, and will hopefully help you to make different decisions, right, about the people that you interact with, the people who, you know, want rental housing. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to weave in some thinking around sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And I'm pulling some of this thinking from Deepak Chopra, and he's, you know, quite a spiritual person. And he says, you know, there's a very big difference between all of these things. And I love his thinking, which is why I'm sharing it with you today, because I think sometimes we kind of mash these three concepts together and, you know, kind of leverage them or think about them as meaning kind of the same thing, but they're different, very different. So if we think about sympathy, sympathy is all about, you know, being on the periphery, right? And, you know, you're seeing someone who's struggling, you see someone who's suffering, and you're like, gosh, like that must be so difficult, right? So you're on the periphery, you're seeing what's happening, and you're connecting, but it's very superficial connection. Okay? Empathy, on the other hand, is different. And this is where, you know, the connection gets a little bit stronger, right? Because you're not just seeing what's happening and, you know, thinking, gosh, that must be difficult. You're actually now feeling, you know, in some way, shape, or form, the same difficulty, right? So the way that I like to think about sympathy and empathy, you know, when I sympathize with you, I feel for you, right? So that this might, you know, elicit pity, right? You know, I feel sorry for you, right? Empathy is I feel with you, right? I have a shared experience, maybe that I can tap into, right? I've been there, right? I remember how difficult it was. And even if I don't have shared experience, because at the end of the day, right, there is this thing called diversity, and we are different in all kinds of ways, including our life experience. Can I imagine how difficult this must be for you? We call that imagined empathy. Now, sometimes we think that, oh gosh, feeling for someone is enough. We propose that no, right? We actually have an opportunity to take things a step further. And this is where we activate compassion. And compassion is, you know, maybe I feel for you, right? Oh, you poor thing, right? And maybe I feel with you. Gosh, I've been there. I can totally relate. What we want to do is see the suffering, right? See the pain, right? And then do something to alleviate the suffering and remove the pain. That's compassion, right? I take action, you know, whatever that I can do, right, within my power, right? I'm going to step in and do it so I can make the situation a little bit better, a little bit easier for you. Okay? So what I want to do is take this as an example and, or take this, this knowledge, this insight, and weave it into an example, right? So Parvina has recently moved to Canada, and you know she's come to Canada from India. She has been staying with family for the past 9 months, but now she's ready to find her own space, right? She's ready to find her own apartment. Now, you may be looking at Parvina and her story and her experience, and some affinity bias may be showing up. You might be thinking, well, you know, I wasn't born in India, so I don't really, you know, relate. You know, in fact, I was actually born in Canada and have no idea, right, what it's like to move from, like, move my whole entire life, right, from one country to another. Maybe you're looking at Parvina and saying, you know what, I'm not a member of a racialized group. Right, so I have no idea what it's like to walk through the world, right, with your shade of skin. Maybe you're looking at Parvina and you see that she's a woman or identifies as female and you're a man, right? And you identify as male, right? And maybe you own your own home, right? So you're not in this current circumstance where you're, looking for housing. So because there's this disconnect, right, because of all of these differences that exist, right, that thing called connection might be difficult, right? Affinity bias might be presenting a barrier, which means you might not feel inclined to help and support and show compassion to Parvina. So with that in mind, right, you might feel sorry for her. Gosh, starting a new life in Canada, that must be really, really hard, right? Maybe you can empathize with her, right? Maybe you think about starting out early in your life, you've just left school, or you just graduated and you're looking for your first apartment, right? And you remember, right, how difficult that was. And you know what? There's also the option to activate some compassion and say, you know what? I'm going to do everything that I can, right, to make sure that, Parvina can find housing, because she needs that. Everyone needs that to survive and thrive. So sympathy, empathy, compassion, right? Those are things you can add to your toolkit, right, to help you be more inclusive. What else can you do? Well, back to this notion of perception bias, right? We know that's a trap that we can step into as we move through the world, right? And as we experience life, and as we interact with other people, right? There are these things called facts and evidence, right? So it's information that is presented. But as we move through the world, right, and experience life and interact with people that are different from us, we have to remember that we also have these biases, these beliefs, these thoughts, these opinions, these stories, these narratives about people who are different from us. And what's so interesting and what we need to be really conscious of, intentional about, is that the intersection of these two things actually impacts or influences what we actually see or what we actually do. Because remember, beliefs become behaviors. And even though we're presented with facts and evidence, right, sometimes we ignore the facts and the evidence and we hang on to the story that we've got in our minds that, are telling us, this is right, this is true. So this is perception bias, maybe intersecting with a little bit of confirmation bias. So let's look at an example of this, right? Here are some facts, right? Trang just told an extremely offensive joke that was gender-based. And as you look around, the meeting room or the lunchroom or wherever this is taking place, right, some people are laughing. If we go back to kind of, the story that's swirling in your head, maybe Trang has a halo over his head, right? So the halo effect might be coming into play here, and you're thinking, but Trang's a really nice person. So what happens is we ignore some of the facts. We ignore some of the evidence, right? We ignore the fact that the joke that was told, right, was offensive. But we pay attention to the fact that people are laughing. We pay attention to the fact that Tran is nice, right? So we allow Tran to misbehave, right? We let it go. If we look at another example and go back to Parvina, we know that Parvina's just moved to Canada, right? And she needs a place to live. Right? We might have a belief that says, gosh, she's new to Canada. I don't know what her credit is like. Maybe she won't be able to pay the rent or pay it on time. So what do we end up seeing? We see someone who's not going to pay the rent, right? What do we end up doing? Because beliefs become behaviors. We bypass her application, right? We overlook her as a potential applicant. So even though Parvina might have some really good credit history, right, we eliminate her as a possible candidate for, tenancy, because we have this story that says, I'm not even going to bother. I'm not going to waste my time running her credit because, she's new to Canada. She's probably not going to be able to pay the rent. Definitely not equitable. Certainly not fair, right? And absolutely discriminatory, because it's creating hardship for Parvina and it's denying her access to an important resource, which is housing. So what is the opportunity for us? Well, certainly we have to be accountable, right? We have to be accountable for, our thoughts and our beliefs. We have to recognize that we're biased. We have to be intentional about checking, what's stored in our minds. We have to be curious, right? Where did that information come from? Is it true? Is it true of all people? Why do I keep leaning on this information? Are there any, facts that can dispute what I already believe to be true? And then what we want to do is pair that accountability with something called humility. And humility says, you know what, I'm human. And what that means is I'm imperfect, right? And what that also means is that I sometimes might make a mistake, right? I sometimes might misstep. But gosh, if there's someone around me who can help me hold myself accountable, who can shine light on the fact that I might be stereotyping or discriminatory in my decision making, right? I want to say to that person, thank you. I thank you for, challenging me and my thinking and the path that I'm going down. So very quickly, some tips that can help us kind of pair these two things quite nicely. Understand, right, what your story is. Right? Get curious, where did it come from? Right? Sometimes what's stored in our minds, it comes from life experience. We get that. But sometimes that life experience and the stories that are stored there come from the people who raised us and their own belief about people who were different from them, and how that information sometimes gets unconsciously implanted, right, in our own minds. Again, instead of moving forward with blinders, move forward with a wide angle lens, right? Look for information that might dispute what you already believe to be true, right? Challenge your thinking, speak to other people. So, here's what I'm thinking, and here's the rationale for my decision. Am I off on this one? Can you just kind of be the check and balance for me to make sure that I'm not being discriminatory, right? Or that I'm not overlooking something, or that I'm not stepping into this expedience bias trap, right? Making a quick decision that's knee-jerk instead of gaining perspective. Right? Disputing evidence, I already talked about that. And then I love this concept of intellectual humility, right? Essentially, all that's saying is, are you willing to recognize that your intellect, right, your thinking, right, is wrong, right? And when someone points it out, instead of getting defensive and argumentative and combative, right, be open to the feedback and say, gosh, I never thought about it that way. Thank you for shining new light, right? Thank you for inviting me to think about things differently, because we know that when we're thinking differently, that sets us up to do things differently. So that was a lot. I wanted to, let me just check the time here. Okay, I wanted to close with a video from Simon Sinek. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's a thought leader. He's an author. A lot of his work actually focuses on leadership, but I was able to find this video, which I think has connections to leadership, but for me, it actually has connections to humanity. Okay? So I leave you with this closing thought as we get ready for some Q&A. So let me just set us up here to watch the video. And Hunter, I'll lean on you to make sure you can see it and hear it once I start it. I think I've done all the right things here from the technical gymnastics perspective. Here we go.
Acts of kindness, acts of generosity is how simple it is to make people feel good. I was walking down the streets of New York City, and a guy walking in front of me, his backpack opened and a bunch of paper fell out on the street. I didn't think much of it. I bent down, I gathered up the papers, handed them back to him, and pointed out that his bag had opened. Now, in our bodies, there's a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin is responsible for all the warm and fuzzies, unicorns and rainbows. It's responsible for all the warm feelings and connectedness we have with each other. Friendship, love. Huge amounts of oxytocin surge through a woman's body as she gives birth. This is what is responsible for the mother-child bond. Oxytocin binds human beings. There are many ways to get oxytocin. One of them is acts of kindness and acts of generosity. It feels good when we do something nice for someone. It feels good when someone does something nice for us. On this particular day, I did something for someone with no expectation of anything in return. I got a little surge of oxytocin. I felt good. He turned to me and he said, "Thank you. It feels nice when someone does something for us with no expectation of anything in return." He felt good. I walked to the end of the street. I'm waiting to cross the street. And a total stranger who happened to be standing next to me said, "I saw what you did back there. That was really cool." As it turns out, witnessing an act of generosity releases oxytocin, and he felt good. And the best part about oxytocin is the more oxytocin we have in our bodies, the more generous we become. It is Mother Nature's way of trying desperately to get us to look after each other. I can guarantee you that that man who witnessed what I did something nice for somebody that day simply because he saw someone do something nice for somebody that day. So what if we commit to do something nice for someone with no expectation of anything in return? Imagine what happens at work. Imagine what happens at home. Imagine what happens with our friends. But it must be genuine.
We'll pause it there. And if I bookend our conversation today, we started with some food for thought from Brene Brown, who spoke about connection, right, which is all about making people feel seen, right, sending messages that says, you know, I hear you, right, I value you as a member of this community, of our society. And back to Richard Branson, right, if the goal is to be successful in business and, you know, whatever size, you know, our business happens to be, right, it is about making connection. Inclusion starts with I, and my hope is that I'm leaving you through this conversation today with some ideas, some insights, some information that can help you as the I, right, to be more inclusive as you run your business and as you move through the world. So with that, Hunter, I am going to actually stop sharing, I think, and turn things to you.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Renee. As always, very informative, enlightening. Thank you to our members for your attention on this. We have some questions that we kind of want to go through. So could you provide perhaps maybe just an example? I know you kind of already have in some ways, but just to kind of recap here of where a landlord might make a biased decision that could result in discrimination.
Thanks for the question, Hunter. And yeah, you know, if we go back to the presentation, the example with Parvina, right, affinity bias, right, could affect the decision that we make. We don't connect, you don't look like me. You know, therefore, I think I prefer someone who's a little bit more similar to me, right? So we could step into that bias trap. You know, perception bias, you know, when we think about what shapes our thinking, yeah, life experience, but, you know, what we consume in the media, right? What the news is saying about people and, you know, their diversity dimensions, you know, the movies that we watch on Netflix, right? In our downtime, you know, sometimes people are portrayed stereotypically. So we might watch a movie portraying a young Black man standing on a street corner selling drugs, carrying a gun, hurting people. And then we have a young Black man, right, who wants, you know, to get our rental housing. Perception bias might say, you're dangerous, so I don't want you part of this, you know, my community, right? I don't want you in, you know, in my home. So I think we need to be mindful of what we hold on to as truth in our minds. And going back to, you know, curiosity and accountability, you know, to just really question it. Like, is this true of this person? And, you know, the initial answer is probably, I don't know, right? Because all we know is them on paper, or, you know, what we're seeing kind of, you know, present, and, you know, first impression that we, you know, form a conclusion in 10 seconds. So, you know, let's run the credit, right? Let's do the reference checks, right? To, you know, really get a better assessment or a holistic assessment of who this person is. So I don't know if that answers your question, Hunter.
I think that does. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. What are some legal requirements of housing providers that they need to be aware of when it comes to this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, great question. So in Canada, and I'm not a lawyer, right? So I need to preface my answer to this question by
That's our
saying,
next presentation, so
okay,
we're good.
Okay, woo. So, you know, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I love that you're bringing in that legal expertise. But what I will say at a very high level, you know, in Canada, we have this thing called the Human Rights Act, and that's, you know, that's federal legislation that, you know, should, you know, drive decision and how we, you know, are interacting with people who are different from us, you know, across the country. What's interesting is I believe the language in the Human Rights Act says, you know, equal access. I think we need to also kind of be mindful of fair access, right? And that's what equity is all about, right? Equal says, I treat you all the same, right? And that can be dangerous because in treating people the same, we ignore the diversity that exists, right? We don't see that people are different. It's okay to see that we're different. It's okay to acknowledge the differences. And in fact, I think we have to if the goal is to be inclusive, right? I might need to understand that, back to Parvina, right? She maybe doesn't have a lot of, credit established in Canada, right? That's a diversity dimension versus someone like me who was born and raised in Canada, right? I have a longer history in this country. So, how do those types of things, impact our decision making? And then if we layer in a little bit of compassion, right, we might say, oh my gosh, like the Parvina, she's got good enough credit, her reference checks, are checking out, maybe I should give this person a shot, right, at rental housing, because all the things say that she'll be, on time with her rent and, a great contributor to this community. So none of that happens though if expedience bias is entering into the decision-making is entering into our decision making, because what happens is we make quick decisions versus taking a step back and saying, what, I wonder, what kind of difference could I make in Parvina's life, right? Because I gave her a shot. I don't know if that's helpful.
Very helpful, definitely. So I think we'll just get to one last question here. Without looking just at the legal requirements that we've heard about. So you mentioned the Human Rights Act in BC. Of course, it's the Human Rights Code that's provincial legislation. They go hand in hand. There's obviously I've talked earlier about the Personal Information Protection Act and such. So without looking at those legal requirements, those statutes, how can a landlord rental housing provider ensure that their selection process promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion?
What a great question. And, first and foremost, and this is my own kind of belief and philosophy, I don't believe that we should have to have legislation in place to be good humans, right? So back to Simon Sinek and this notion of being, nice. I, in fact, recently read an article that was making a distinction between being nice and being kind, right? And I love the distinction that they made because they said, the nice person won't tell you that you have lettuce in your teeth, right? Because they don't want to embarrass you. They don't want to make you feel bad. Like that's being nice. The kind person will tell you that you have lettuce in your teeth because they don't want you to feel embarrassed as you go forward throughout your day with food in your teeth, right? So I think, it would be wonderful if people could build their kindness muscles, right? And, not feel pity for people, right, which is sympathy, but feel empathy or activate empathy, and imagine the struggle, the difficulty, and trying to get some of these basic access to these basic things, right? A job so I can buy food and pay for housing, right? Housing so that I can feel safe and get good sleep so I can go back to my job the next day and perform well. So these things all work hand in hand. So I believe that it would be wonderful if we didn't need to have legislation in place for people to be more kind, right, to be more inclusive. But thank goodness we do here in Canada because it reminds us to do the right thing. Outside of that, I think it's about being more aware. And I know that sounds so simple, but back to this idea that we're all biased, right? Because we have life experience and, people who raised us and we consume media. I think it's about being aware of what's stored in here. And is that the right information to bring into this decision that I'm making right now? And sometimes the story is still, or the answer to that question for us is still yes. So how do I check? Like, how do I, how do I activate humility where, I'm saying, am I off on this one? Like, how do you see it? So, getting more people when appropriate involved in decision-making can be helpful. Back to I see you, I hear you, and you're valued. If you have multi-unit housing, right? How do you create community? Right in that, right? How do you, acknowledge that everyone is welcomed here? We're coming up on the holiday season. The holiday season looks different for different people, right? You might embrace Christmas. Not everybody celebrates Christmas. So how do we, acknowledge in our rental housing, office, right? As an example that, we see your holiday, right? And we value your holiday. So I think it's the little things that actually make a big difference in sending a message to people that says, I see you, I see that you're different, I hear you, and you know what, I value you, and I value every part of you, right? And even though that's different, you are welcome here. So I don't know if that's helpful, Hunter.
Very helpful, as always. Well, thank you so much, Renee. I see that a few people have popped in the Q&A. Thank yous as well. So thank you to our attendees for that. Again, always very, very useful information. And as I mentioned before, this session is recorded, so we'll be sharing it with our members. So if you have not, if you missed part of this, definitely can go back and access that information at a later date. So again, thank you so much, Renee.
Well, Hunter, thank you again for inviting me to be part of the conversation, and thanks to everyone who's online today. I wish everyone well, right, as they step forward into the weekend. So thanks again, Hunter. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.